As we begin to look a little bit closer at how to create a much more elaborate CSS layout, one of the first things I want to discuss with you is a little bit about HTML5 semantics. You'll notice that I happen to have in the Files Management window, I'm pointing to the source files in Chapter 5. And in the Position folder, you can see that there are two files that I currently have open. One that says HTML5 Start, and this one here called Layout. You can open up both of those. HTML5 Start is pretty empty, doesn't really have much going on with it. Layout is a much more elaborate layout that examines all of the different types of positioning that we've been looking at in the previous videos, and it also has a few other new things. To begin with, let's preview Layout inside of our browser. Any browser will do. As you can see here, if I were to try and resize this window, you'll notice that the entire area of my website is centered on the page. I've just put in some very basic color schemes so you can see things a little bit differently. I happen to have a navigation system right underneath this heading area, and it's this one right here. And you'll notice I've done a few things with it. I've also added some CSS3 transitions, something that we can do inside of Dreamweaver. Notice when I roll over these elements, not only do they just blink their color change, they actually start fading into view. I've also added this area right underneath the navigation, which is basically set up for 3 different sections of the website. And you'll notice that it too also has some CSS3 transition applied to it. So these are 3 sections, one after each other. Underneath that, we happen to have an article of text right here, actually 2 of them. And I have a small little aside, which we can put any number of different things. We can put links in here, you can have extraneous information or anything else that you'd need. Also, I've included a footer area down at the bottom, but this footer area also includes a number of sections inside of it. There's one section here for a little form element for people to subscribe, and some other miscellaneous text that I've included in this area. Now, looking at this finalized version, we can sort of examine in its very simple state, not really much going on here, although it's organized quite well, it still needs a number of elements to be styled to make it look into a real working website. But it is, in fact, very well organized from the perspective of HTML5. And essentially what we have is a section at the top known as a header. This area here is our navigation area. 3 sections, an article, an aside, and a footer that has its own set of sections. So what we're going to be doing now is learning how to prepare a plain old HTML website so that it looks a little bit more like this. And one of the first things I want you to do is to go to the HTML5 start.html. In the past, what we normally would have done was to create all of these sections that I just outlined in the layout HTML page within their own respective divs. And each of those divs would be given their own respective ID. There would be an ID for the header section and the nav section, among others. However, along comes HTML5. Now, if you're not familiar with the basics of working with HTML5, I strongly suggest that you check out some of killersites.com's other HTML5 titles, one of which I've also created, and you'll find that they're extremely helpful for getting past this particular point in time. The thing I really want to bring to your attention here is that HTML5 is something that most web developers are moving towards. And the world of web development is one that is constantly evolving, and this evolution is one that is evolving for the better. In the past, working with an older model like XHTML, you would end up with a lot of extra information in doc types and a lot of bloated code that really wasn't necessary. Meta tags that were just built up with like tons of information that at this point in time is not very needed. However, there are some drawbacks to jumping into the HTML5 environment. One of the main reasons is because HTML5 tags are not necessarily supported by every single browser. But, as I mentioned, there are ways of getting around this so that we can still start looking at a more advanced way of creating websites and not have to worry about any of the older fallbacks. So here's how we go about doing that. First of all, let me explain a little bit about the layout that I'm looking for. You'll notice that I've created a number of elements in my code. Right now, if we were to examine that code, you would see one thing in particular, which is this div ID with the ID called wrapper, the opening of the div and the closing of the div. You'll also notice that at the closing of this div, I've included a small comment. And you can see here, I'll apply a HTML comment because this is a HTML document. So here I'm just going to say wrapper. And basically what that's telling me or anybody else, if you have multiple divs littered throughout your HTML document, this is going to make it a lot easier to know which div is the closing tag for whichever div starts it. So this wrapper does just what it says, wraps around the entire HTML page. So you'll notice the wrapper ID is the first thing that appears after the body, and it is also the first thing that appears before the closing of the body. So the closing div, it wraps around all of the elements. Well, within these elements, you'll see that there's not much going on. This is the div that wraps around everything, that big box. If I go back to my code view, the next thing we need to do is to think about our layout. So here is layout.html as I showed you before. This area up on top normally would have been created with a div with an ID called header. This area here, same, a div with the ID called nav. And these as well as the ones on the bottom, as well as a footer. However, along comes HTML5, and what HTML5 is saying is, instead of using div with an ID called header, why don't we just use a tag called the header tag? And as you can see, I've created one right here. Now I've written this out myself in the code view, and I strongly suggest that you do the same. If you want to take advantage of HTML5, at this point in time, that's exactly what you're going to need to do. We could have just come in here and added an insert by going to layout and working with div tags. But as you can see, there's no HTML5 support inside of this insert menu here. So we're going to have to take our hand at writing it ourselves. So open header, closing header. Within that, I've just created a h1 tag called header. Then, same as I mentioned before, HTML5 says instead of creating a div with an ID called nav, why don't we just create a nav tag? People will know what it means just by looking at it. I won't have confusing closing div tags and not know what their opening tags are because I know that a nav is a navigation. And I can have more than one on the page if I wanted to. At that point, I could specify, sure, here's a nav with an ID called main nav, and here's another nav with an ID called side nav, or something like that. Also, you'll notice that in the layout, I have 3 areas here. They're not necessarily articles. If we looked at it in live view, these are those rollover elements that I put in here. I'm eventually going to be substituting the letters A, Z, and G for some icons. And when we do that, we're going to treat this almost as if it's a link to another page. So they're kind of like little spotlight sections. Well, given that, then we can semantically come in here and really just think of the same thing. Here is a section. So we're going to create multiple sections. Let's do that together. So I'll come in here, and certainly we can copy paste this, but I'm just going to hit the return key and show you that if we write this code in ourselves, and I say section, notice that Dreamweaver recognizes the section tag when we're writing it inside of our code view. So I could just double click that and finish that off. That's my opening section. Come down. Dreamweaver is smart enough when I put a forward slash to close that section area as well. I'll copy the information inside of it and place that in here. Now we'll copy all of this section and we'll paste it underneath. Now we have 3 sections, much like we did in our layout. At this point, if we take a look at our layout, you'll also see that underneath the sections that I've created, there happens to be 2 other areas. One that has articles and one that has an aside of text. So we can just use some very logical information underneath our sections. I'll come in here, and the first one that I want to introduce is the article tag. And what do you think would be inside of an article tag? Well, it's absolutely exactly what you would think. Articles. So why not put them in here? I'm going to take the H2 and paragraphs that we had from here, and I'm going to copy them and put them inside the open article tag, and then I will close this article tag. So Dreamweaver recognizes the article tag and sees it as a potential tag that we could use to create information. Notice I already have the aside tag in place. Now let's just come in here and change what the headline says here. So I'll say article dash subheader. And these ones are the section subheader, so I can come in and do the same thing. Section dash subheader. I'll copy that and paste it into my code right here. The aside subheader, I'll get into this as well and change what it says, is just what the name implies, something that's on the side. Finally, we also have something called a footer. In my layout, you'll notice that I have this large gray section at the bottom as a footer. Now, inside that footer, we also have individual sections. We'll get to that later. At this point in time, I'm really just interested in creating the layout that we see before us right now. So, if we go back to the HTML5 start, you'll see footer closing footer. And I'm going to change this text here and make it say footer subheadline. So at this point, you've got the basic HTML5 semantic tags in place. So semantic because they kind of make sense, right? Section is a section, and an article is an article, and an aside is an aside, and a footer is a footer, and a header is a header, and a nav is a nav. It all is very logical. However, the only caveat to working with this, as I mentioned before, is that, well, some browsers don't really know what these things are. They were created after earlier browsers like IE 6 and 7, among other things. So we need to make these particular tags work with the latest browsers as well as the older ones. So in the next video, when you come back, I'm going to show you about preparing this HTML5 start page so that it can be ready to work with any of the older as well as newer browsers.